Since all the Freon leaked out, because I have a back compressor, so I don't have to worry about recovering the Freon. First, you need to remove air intake. You need to remove this hose and the supercharger intake. Remove that, but leave radiator coolant hose on there. You don't want all the coolant leaked out. Now you need to loosen these clamp right here before you can take supercharger intake out. There's two Torx bolt holding supercharger air intake. There's one down there and another one down there. So you need to remove those two Torx bolts before you can remove supercharger air intake. It's a 10mm Torx socket. You need T55 Torx socket to remove the belt for the so you can loosen the tensioner, so you can take the belt out. Now you need to disconnect the ECU and remove the air filter box. You need T25 Torx socket to remove the air filter box. You need to disconnect the sensor right here and this right here. You need T20 Torx socket to remove this ECU wire mounting. You need to disconnect this right here. Just squeeze this and pull up and disconnect this sensor. Little trick to loosen these bolts in there. There's one and there's another one right there. Is to use a 1/4 inch ratchet and a socket. Is a 10mm socket to fit into this hole, and they'll fit perfectly. This clamp right here, and you need a special tool to loosen that clamp. You need this clamp compressor right here. You can get this off eBay. It's not expensive at all. I think it's like $10-$20, somewhere around there, in order to loosen the clamp. Did you see how the clamp goes on? That's how it should be. And then you squeeze. Now the clamp is loose, and you just leave the tool on there to hold the clamps open. You also need to disconnect this hose. You need to disconnect this hose too. Just squeeze and pull. You need T20 to remove this 2 Torx screw and move the wire out of the way, and disconnect this sensor right here. Make sure you cover this holes right here. You can use a rag or a paper so nothing will fall inside there. Then you need to disconnect this wire, fuel injector wires. All 4, just disconnect them. So you need to remove the intake manifold to get access to a AC compressor. There's one bolt right here. There's another one down there. This one right here. There's also one more bolt hiding inside there. And there's one more right there. Right there, you can see it. Right there. Need to remove that. I also forgot to mention there's one more right here too, right there. And you need to disconnect this hose right here too. Move this clip out of the way, and don't forget to disconnect this sensor right here. There's two of them, and remove this wire harness out. Move this hose and this hose. Also remove this hose. You also need to remove this hose right here, and then you need to remove the fuel rail. Remove the fuel rail. Now you can leave it hanging like that, it'll be fine. You just need to take the intake manifold out. Leave a little clearance so you can take this out. Now you need to remove the skid plate so you can have access to the bottom of the AC compressor, so you can take the bolts out from the bottom. There's Torx bolt holding the compressor on, which is one down there, and there's one right there that's holding the compressor on. That bolt right there. You're gonna need to remove this line right here, the low side line that's connected to the AC compressor. Removing the bolt that's holding the line to the compressor. You need to use C230 to remove that bolt. Now you need to disconnect this line right there, the AC line. There's two AC lines connected to the compressor, one for low side and one for high side. Now I ran into a problem. I could not disconnect this hose right here. So what I'm gonna do is disconnect it from the other end. This end right here, where I'm gonna disconnect it from. So I have to loosen this mount right here and disconnect this part so I can take it out from the top. Now this method worked. See, I took it off from the other end because this one was so stubborn I can't remove it. Okay, let's compare the old compressor to a new compressor. I can see a little different for this cover right here for the hose. So what I'm gonna do is exchange this cover right here with this one. I'm going to remove this pin right here and transfer it to the new one, since the new one doesn't have one. The connectors seem to be the same. All the mounting is the same. Basically it's the same compressor, it's just slightly different, probably just to make it work for a certain model. But this one I can just swap the part out. Now the pulley, it has the same diameter, but the clutch it looks a little bit different than the new one. So it's not the exact match, but it'll work. Now this is an old compressor. It's the new compressor. Fits perfectly and it's the same size, as you can see. Now I swap it out already, and the pin. That's the old one. Now it's the new one. Now you gotta fill in 2 ounces of PAG oil, or what you call, usually they call it compressor oil, but the compressor oil is PAG oil for new AC system, the 134A. What you do, turn the compressor, make sure all the oil get inside, and before you put it on, make sure remove the old O-ring and replace it with a new O-ring. Now it's time to reinstall the compressor. Now go ahead and reinstall the AC line. Now reinstall this line back and the mounting bracket. Now the line is connected and the mounting bracket are tight. Now all the AC lines are installed and tightened. Next step is what I usually do. I'm gonna pull a vacuum first. Make sure there's no leaks in the lines that I open up before I mount the AC compressor. The reason that I'm pulling a vacuum before mount all the parts back on is that just in case if there's a leak in those seals, those O-ring seals that I open up, I can just go ahead and replace it or tighten some more instead of put everything back together and then pull a vacuum and there's a vacuum leak. Then you have to take all those parts back out again. That's why I'm preventing that to happen, just in case. If it does happen, then I don't have to take all those parts apart. Basically, it'll save you time. Alright, after putting a vacuum and verify that there's no air leak in the system, now it's time to put everything back together. Alright, getting the last bolt onto the compressor. Now before put the intake manifold back on, you need to clean the port out real good. Spray some carburetor cleaner, kind of clean the surface up a little bit. Now spray some carb cleaner onto the intake and kind of clean it up before you put it back on. Now when you put the intake bolt back on, make sure put a little drop of Loctite on there. Now reinstall the fuel rail. Next, reinstall the injector connectors. Now it's time to reinstall all the hoses and all the connectors back on. Now it's time to reinstall the air filter box. After the intake box install, just release the clamp. Tighten all the bolts. Connect this back. Connect the airflow meter sensor. Connect this sensor back. Reinstall the air filter. Put the air filter cover back on. Don't forget to connect the air hose back on. Now reinstall the drive belt. This is how the belt should go on there. Now the belt has to go around that tensioner right there. Once it's on the tensioner, then it'll be done. Once the belt is on the tensioner, slowly release the tensioner. Reinstall the supercharger intake. And don't forget to mount the supercharger intake to the block. Reinstall the air intake. Reinstall the cover back on. Reinstall the last cover. Everything is done. Thanks for watching.